Washington's Department of Natural Resources has confirmed something that has never happened before in the state's recorded history. More structures lost to a single wildfire event than in any fire on record here. Not a forest fire that wandered too close to town. Not a freak accident nobody saw coming. What actually happened is that 3 separate fires, driven by a fast-moving dry cold front, converted an ordinary Spokane weekend into the most destructive urban wildfire the state has ever documented. And here's the twist that matters more than the headline number. The structure count isn't even the part officials are most focused on right now. It's the fact that, as of the latest updates, they still can't say with certainty what the full human toll is because search teams haven't reached every affected block yet. If you live anywhere in the inland Pacific Northwest, in a dry summer city that sits near open grassland or shrubland, this isn't a story about somewhere else. It's a preview of a risk your own neighborhood may already carry. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how 3 fires ignited and grew large enough to destroy an estimated 700 structures in a single weekend, what specific weather conditions turned a manageable fire into one that overwhelmed containment efforts entirely, how this event compares to other major wind-driven urban fires in the American West over the last dozen years, what officials are and are not yet able to confirm about injuries and losses as assessment work continues, and what the honest, unresolved questions still are about how a place like Spokane got here. If you're in Spokane County or anywhere in eastern Washington right now, subscribe before you do anything else because containment is still at 0%, and this situation is changing by the hour. And here's a question only people watching this story could actually answer. Are you inside the evacuation zone right now, or do you have family? Who is? Drop that in the comments because on-the-ground accounts are genuinely more current than most news coverage can be. Let's start with why Spokane burns the way it does, because the geography here isn't incidental, it's the entire setup. Spokane sits on the dry side of the Cascade Mountains, in what meteorologists call a rain shadow. Think of the Cascades as a giant wall facing the Pacific Ocean. Moist air rolls in off the water, hits that wall, and is forced upward, where it cools and dumps most of its moisture as rain and snow on the western slopes, the wet side that gives Seattle its reputation. By the time that same air comes down the other side of the mountains, it's already wrung out, like a sponge that's been squeezed dry before it gets handed to the next person. That's why Spokane's summers run hotter, drier, and increasingly longer than the stereotype most people have of the Pacific Northwest as a green, rainy place. This year arrived with an extra deficit already built into that dry pattern. The region's winter snowpack, which normally melts gradually through spring and slowly feeds moisture into the soil, came in well below normal this year and melted earlier than usual, according to regional drought monitoring. That timing matters more than the shortfall itself. A slow snowmelt acts like a faucet left on a low drip for months, keeping grass and brush greener longer into summer. An early, fast melt is more like turning that faucet off in April instead of June. The ground dries out faster, and it stays dry for a longer stretch of the fire season. Layer a summer of well above average heat on top of that early dry out, and by August, the fine fuels around Spokane's neighborhoods, dead grass, dried weeds, pine needles, and leaf litter, had been drying continuously for weeks, with almost no rain to interrupt the process. Now, here's the mechanism that turned that dry landscape into an actual catastrophe, and it comes down to wind, not just heat. A wildfire needs 3 things to grow large: fuel, dry conditions, and wind. Spokane had all 3 lined up at once this weekend, but it was the wind event specifically that fire behavior analysts point to as the reason this didn't stay a manageable brush fire. A dry, cold front pushed through the region on Saturday, and Spokane's airport recorded sustained winds of 33 miles per hour, gusting to 44. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the difference between a stiff breeze that rustles leaves and a wind strong enough to snap small branches off trees and drive flames sideways instead of straight up. Wind-driven fires behave completely differently than fires that burn in calm conditions. In calm air, a fire spreads outward fairly evenly and predictably, the way a stain spreads on a paper towel. Add strong, sustained wind, and the fire stops spreading like a stain and starts spreading like a blowtorch. Pointed in one direction, the flames lean forward. Radiant heat preheats the fuel ahead of the fire so it ignites almost instantly, and the whole system moves as a single, fast advancing front. This is the same basic physics behind the notorious Santa Ana winds that drive Southern California's worst fire seasons, and the Diablo winds that do the same thing in Northern California. Different names, different mountain ranges, same underlying mechanism of dry air accelerating down a pressure gradient and slamming into fire-prone landscape. Eastern Washington has its own regional version of this pattern, tied to high pressure building over the Great Basin to the south, And this weekend's cold front passage produced a version of it strong enough to overwhelm initial firefighting efforts almost immediately. Once wind that's strong meets fuel that dry, the fire generates a mechanism of its own that makes it far more dangerous than the flame front alone: embers. As a fire burns hot and fast, it creates a rising column of superheated air and gases directly above it. Picture it like the plume above a bonfire, just vastly larger and more violent. That column can loft burning embers, sometimes small chunks of burning bark or pine cone, high into the air, where wind then carries them forward, ahead of the main fire. Reporting on the Old Trails fire, one of the 3 blazes that burned into northwest Spokane, describes embers being thrown more than half a mile ahead of the flame front. That's the critical number to understand here, because half a mile is far enough that a homeowner watching smoke on a distant horizon can reasonably believe they have time, while embers from that same fire are already landing on their own roof. And where those embers land matters enormously. An ember landing on bare pavement does nothing. An ember landing in a gutter clogged with dry pine needles, on a wood shake roof, on a dry welcome mat, or in a woodpile stacked against a house, has everything it needs to start a brand new fire, right at the structure, with no wildland fire in sight yet. Fire scientists call this spotting, and it's the single mechanism most responsible for turning what officials once treated as a rural or edge-of-town problem into something that can jump deep into an established residential neighborhood in minutes. Once enough of these spot fires ignite close together inside a neighborhood, the event stops behaving like a wildfire spreading from the outside in and starts behaving like a structure fire spreading from house to house to house, driven by the radiant heat of burning buildings rather than burning grass. Fire officials have a specific term for that transition: an urban firestorm, and multiple assessments of this weekend's Spokane fires have used exactly that language to describe what happened once the fires crossed from open land into the built city. Let's walk through the confirmed numbers from this weekend, because each one tells you something specific about the scale of what happened, not just the fact that it was bad. First, the combined footprint of the Old Trails, Fairview, and Autumn Lane fires reached close to 10,000 acres by Monday afternoon. An acre is roughly the size of a football field without the end zones, so that's the equivalent of about 10,000 football fields burned in under 3 days. And remember, containment across all 3 fires sat at 0% at that point, meaning firefighters had not yet managed to build a controlled, held line around any complete edge of any of the 3 fires. Second, an estimated 700 structures were destroyed, and officials have been clear that number is expected to rise as damage assessment teams reach areas they haven't yet been able to safely access. To put that structure count in context, that's roughly the scale of losing every building in a small town in a single weekend. Third, approximately 65,000 people were placed under evacuation orders. Spokane's population is around 230,000, which means close to 3 in every 10 residents of the city were told to leave their homes at the same time, all moving through the same limited road network within a compressed window of hours. A scenario that stresses traffic capacity, shelter capacity, and communication systems simultaneously, not just firefighting resources. Fourth, temperatures during the event reached 86 degrees Fahrenheit, with relative humidity down around 20 to 25%. That humidity number is the one meteorologists watch closest for fire behavior, because dry fuels lose moisture fastest when the surrounding air itself is starved of moisture. Dry air pulls water out of grass and brush the same way a dry towel pulls water off a wet countertop. And at 20 to 25% relative humidity, fine fuels can reach a moisture content low enough to ignite almost on contact with a spark or ember. Fifth, this event has already destroyed more structures than any other single wildfire event in Washington's recorded history, surpassing the Valpo previous benchmark by a wide margin. That last point deserves its own explanation, because worst on record is a phrase that gets used loosely in disaster coverage, and here it has a specific, checkable meaning. To understand what worst on record actually means in this case, it helps to look at Washington's own fire history, because there isn't just one bar being cleared here. There are 2 different kinds of records, and this event breaks a different one than you might expect. The largest wildfire in Washington's recorded history by total acreage is the Carlton Complex Fire, which burned in Okanogan County in July of 2014. That fire began as 4 separate lightning-ignited blazes in the Metho Valley that merged into one massive fire, eventually burning more than 256,000 acres, roughly the size of the city of Chicago, and destroying somewhere between 300 and 350 homes, mostly in and around the small towns of Pateros and Brewster. 1 life was lost, a homeowner who suffered a fatal cardiac event while defending his property. Carlton Complex remains by far the biggest fire Washington has ever recorded in terms of raw acreage burned, but it burned mostly through rural valley terrain, orchard land, and small towns with a few thousand residents each. Devastating for those communities, but a fundamentally different exposure profile than a fire tearing directly into an established city of 230,000 people. This weekend's Spokane fires are a fraction of the size of Carlton Complex in acreage, at roughly 10,000 acres versus 250,000, but they've already destroyed more than double the number of structures in days rather than weeks, because they burned directly into dense residential neighborhoods rather than largely rural land. That's the distinction that matters. Carlton Complex is Washington's biggest fire by size. This weekend's Spokane fires are already Washington's most destructive fire by structures lost, and they're not finished growing. Spokane's own institutional memory has a benchmark event too, and it's the one local officials keep returning to in comparison, the Firestorm of 1991. On October 16th of that year, roughly 90 separate wildfires broke out across Spokane County within a matter of hours, after gale force winds, gusting over 60 miles per hour, knocked down power lines into tinder-dry brush following a 42-day stretch without meaningful rain. The fires destroyed somewhere between 112 and 114 homes and killed 2 people, a Spokane area woman who died attempting to flee her neighborhood as the fire overtook it, and a young firefighter from a neighboring jurisdiction who was killed while responding to the blazes. It took roughly 6 days, and thousands of firefighters pulled in from across 2 states to bring those fires under control. And the event was serious enough that it directly reshaped how Washington coordinates firefighting resources across county and state lines, leading the state legislature to create a formal mobilization plan so that overwhelmed local fire districts could get help faster in future disasters. For 3 decades, Firestorm 91 was the reference point every Spokane fire official used to describe a worst-case scenario for the city itself. This weekend's fires have already destroyed roughly 6 times as many structures as that benchmark event, and did it in a single weekend instead of 6 days. There's also a much more recent, smaller-scale preview that a lot of Spokane residents will remember vividly, because it happened just weeks earlier. In mid-June of 2026, the Upriver Fire broke out near Camp Sakani, a park area close to a Spokane neighborhood, and rapidly burned around 12.5 homes before crews reached full containment about a week later. 1 person died in that fire, a resident who had chosen not to evacuate when ordered to. Investigators determined the fire was human-caused, though the specific origin wasn't made public. The mechanism was the same one driving this weekend's disaster at a much larger scale: dry fuel, wind, and a fire that reached structures faster than anyone expected. For a city that had just watched a much smaller version of this exact scenario play out in its own backyard less than 2 months earlier, this weekend's fires represent that same risk returning at a scale nobody in Spokane's planning documents had fully accounted for. It's also worth looking outside Washington state entirely, because officials assessing the scale of this weekend's damage have explicitly drawn comparisons to 2 of the most destructive urban wildfire events in recent American history, and understanding those comparisons tells you something real about where this event sits. The first is the Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise, California in November of 2018. That fire became the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California's recorded history, driven into the town by strong, dry winds that carried embers ahead of the main front, the same spotting mechanism at work in Spokane this weekend, just operating in a forested mountain community instead of a high desert city. The second, more recent comparison is to the Palisades and Eaton fires that struck the Los Angeles area in January of 2025. Those 2 fires ignited hours apart, driven by hurricane-force Santa Ana winds gusting close to 90 to 100 miles per hour in the mountains above the city. And together, they burned nearly 40,000 acres, destroyed more than 16,000 structures, and killed at least 31 people over the following weeks, according to official Los Angeles County tallies. Officials assessing Spokane's fires have said the scale of urban destruction here, not the acreage, but the density and speed of structure loss inside an established city, puts this event in the same general category as those Los Angeles fires, even though Spokane's wind speeds this weekend were considerably lower, and the fires here are so far a fraction of the size in both acreage and structures lost. The comparison isn't about the numbers matching, it's about the mechanism matching. Dry fuel, an extreme wind event, and a fire that transitioned from wildland behavior to structure urban behavior far faster than the responding agencies could adjust to. Now let's talk honestly about who actually carries the most risk in an event like this, because it isn't distributed evenly across a city, and understanding that helps explain both why the loss is concentrated where they did and who needs to be thought about first in the response. Residents in neighborhoods built directly against open grassland, shrubland, or pine forest carry the most direct exposure, simply because that's the fuel that catches first and fastest, and it's the fuel closest to their homes. But this weekend's fires also demonstrated something fire scientists have been warning about for years. The ember spotting mechanism means interior neighborhoods, well inside a city and not obviously bordering wildland, can still be reached by fire if enough dry vegetation, wood decking, and cluttered gutters exist along the path embers travel. That reshapes who's actually at risk, extending it well past the traditional edge of town definition. Renters and residents of older or manufactured housing often face a harder recovery even when the immediate danger is equal to anyone else's, because they typically have less financial cushion to absorb a sudden total loss, may carry less insurance coverage, and have less flexibility to relocate quickly afterward. Elderly residents and anyone with limited mobility face the hardest version of the evacuation math, because the gap between a fire being visibly distant and a fire being on your actual street can close in under an hour once wind-driven embers start landing. And that's simply not enough time for everyone to prepare, gather belongings, and physically leave without assistance. Outdoor workers and anyone without reliable access to a vehicle face a genuinely different set of options than someone who can simply get in a car and drive the moment an alert arrives. Public transit and ride availability collapse during a mass evacuation exactly when people without cars need the most. And there's a population that's easy to overlook in disaster coverage focused on structures and acreage. Anyone with asthma, COPD, heart conditions, or who is pregnant faces real health risk from wildfire smoke alone, even well outside the fire's physical path, because fine particulate matter and smoke can travel far beyond the flames and settle deep in the lungs. Spokane's air quality during an event like this can degrade sharply for people many miles from where structures actually burned, which means the health impact of this disaster extends considerably further than the evacuation zone itself. Here's the honest complication. And it's the part of this story that separates a responsible account from one that overclaims certainty it doesn't have. Officials have been explicit on the record that they do not yet have a confirmed count of deaths or serious injuries tied to these fires, and they've said directly that number could still change as crews reach areas they haven't been able to safely enter yet. That is not officials being evasive or hiding something from the public. It's the direct physical consequence of a fire that destroyed hundreds of structures faster than search and assessment teams can move through them on foot, checking each address individually, while active fire and unstable structures remain a hazard to the searchers themselves. Anyone reporting a specific death toll for this event right now, with confidence, is going beyond what officials have actually confirmed. Separately, one arson-related arrest has been made in connection with one of the three fires, but investigators have been clear that this does not explain how all three fires started. And even if every ignition source turns out to be human-caused, that wouldn't change the underlying weather and drought conditions that determined how those fires behaved once they started. A spark dropped into tinder-dry grass with 25% humidity and 40-mile-an-hour wind behind it produces the same catastrophic spread, whether that spark came from arson, an accident, or downed power infrastructure. The conditions, not the ignition source, are what turned a fire into a firestorm. There's also a genuine, unresolved policy debate worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over. Some argue that more aggressive vegetation thinning and forest management on public lands could reduce fuel loads and slow future fires in forested terrain, while others argue that the primary driver of urban fire disasters like this one is development pattern and city-level vegetation management rather than forest policy, since this weekend's most destructive spread happened in residential neighborhoods, not deep forest. Both sides of that debate have real evidence behind them for their respective terrain types, and this single event doesn't settle it either way, because the specific fuels that carried fire through Spokane's neighborhoods this weekend were urban fuels, dry lawns, hedges, decks, and gutters, not the dense timber stands at the center of the federal forest management debate. And one more honest limit. While this event fits a broader, well-documented trend of earlier snowmelt, extended fire seasons, and more frequent extreme fire weather across the inland Northwest, attributing any single weekend's fire, behavior definitively to long-term climate trends requires the kind of formal scientific attribution study that takes months, not a same-week assessment. So it's accurate to say this event is consistent with that broader trend, without claiming this specific fire has already been formally attributed to it. So what can you actually do with all of this right now, today, whether you're in the immediate evacuation zone or watching this from somewhere else in the fire-prone inland West? First, if you're anywhere in the affected area and haven't already, sign up for your county's emergency alert system. It typically takes about 5 minutes to enroll, and the alerts sent out during this event reached every registered device in the warning area almost immediately. The gap wasn't in the alert system's speed, it was in how many residents had actually signed up for it beforehand. Second, keep a go bag packed and staged near your main exit, containing essential documents, any regular medications, a change of clothes, and basic supplies for a few days away from home. The value of a pre-packed bag isn't convenience, it's time. Every minute you don't spend searching for medication or paperwork during an evacuation is a minute of margin against a fire that, under conditions like this weekend's, can move faster than most people expect. Third, if you live anywhere near open grass, brush, or forest, clear dry vegetation, pine needles, and leaf litter out of your gutters, off your roof, and away from your foundation, and move any wood piles or stacked debris away from the exterior walls of your home. That specific combination, dry gutters, wood roofing, and debris against the structure, is exactly what officials have pointed to as the entry point embers used to ignite homes in Spokane's neighborhoods this weekend. And it's one of the few pieces of fire risk an individual homeowner has direct control over. Fourth, take a few minutes to photograph or video the inside and outside of your home and your major belongings and store those images somewhere other than your phone alone. Cloud storage or email to yourself works. That documentation becomes critical for insurance claims if the worst happens. And it's something almost nobody thinks to do until after a loss, when it's too late. Fifth, if you have elderly neighbors, neighbors with limited mobility, or anyone you know without reliable transportation, check in with them directly, rather than assuming an alert reached them, or that they have a way to leave. This weekend's evacuation numbers show how much pressure a mass simultaneous evacuation puts on a road network. And personal help from a neighbor can close a gap that official systems sometimes can't close fast enough. And finally, if smoke reaches your area, even without a direct fire threat, take it seriously as a health issue, not just an inconvenience. Keep windows closed, run air filtration if you have it, and limit outdoor exertion, especially if you or someone in your household has asthma, a heart condition, or is pregnant. These 3 fires are still burning at 0% containment as this video is being finished. The full damage assessment across all 3 burn areas is still incomplete. The arson investigation into one of the fires is ongoing, and the human toll, the number officials have been most careful and most honest about not overstating, is still being determined block by block, home by home, as search teams reach areas that were simply too dangerous to enter in the fire's first hours. What officials do already know, and what they've said plainly, is that this event has reset what a worst-case wildfire looks like for a Pacific Northwest city that, until this weekend, most of its own residents didn't think of as a wildfire city at all. Whatever the final numbers turn out to be, this story is not finished, and it won't be finished for a long time after the flames themselves are out